What would you do if your HOA president tore down the one piece of your home that carried your memories, and the only weapon you had to fight back was a dam that could drain the entire lake? Simone Hargrave woke up that morning expecting the same view she had seen for nearly 20 years. The stretch of Lake Ashford glittering in the first light, her wooden bridge leading down to the dock where her boat rested, quiet and steady. Instead, what greeted her through the kitchen window was a scar across her land, splintered beams, broken posts, and a pile of wreckage half submerged in the water. Her bridge was gone. She pressed her hands against the glass, her breath catching in her throat. For most people, it was just wood and nails. But to her, it was history. That bridge was where her husband, Thomas, had stood the morning after they closed on the house, hammering the first planks with his wide grin, saying, "This lake will keep us young." It was where her grandchildren had dropped lines in the water and screamed with joy at the tug of their first catch. It was her place of peace, the anchor of her days since Thomas passed. Now it was reduced to debris. Simone stepped outside in her house shoes, crunching over damp grass as she moved toward the shore. She touched one of the jagged boards that had washed up, splinters biting her palm. There was no mistake. The demolition wasn't an accident. The cut edges were clean, sawed with intent. Someone had ordered this. And in her gut, she already knew who. Gerald Wexler. His name landed in her mind like a stone hitting water. Gerald was the president of the Homeowners Association, and he treated the role like a crown. Tall, graying at the temples, and always in pressed polos, Gerald had a habit of talking over people and making decisions that somehow benefited the HOA's chosen few. He had clashed with Simone before, mostly over his obsession with raising fees for his pet project, the fancy Lakeside resort he claimed would increase property values for everyone. Simone had stood her ground, voting against it every time. She wasn't the only one, but she was the most outspoken. And now, the bridge she and Thomas had built together was gone. Her neighbor, Ruth Callan, shuffled out from her back porch, cupping a mug of coffee, her robe flapping in the breeze. Ruth squinted toward the water and called out, "Simone, Lord have mercy! What happened?" Simone turned, her voice trembling but steady enough. "Gerald happened." Who else could have signed off on this? Ruth shook her head, stepping closer. "I heard trucks last night. Thought it was road work." "Didn't know. They were tearing down your bridge." Simone's chest tightened. Trucks in the night, while she slept. Gerald hadn't just broken something she loved. He had done it like a thief. By mid-morning, word had spread across the neighborhood. A few neighbors trickled down to the shoreline. Some clucked their tongues in sympathy. Others avoided her eyes. One man muttered, "Probably for safety." That bridge was old, but Simone caught the way he said it, parroting Gerald's line before it was even spoken. At noon, Gerald himself appeared. He parked his black SUV at the curb and walked down with his trademark confident stride. His sunglasses flashed in the sun, and he carried a clipboard under his arm, the same way he had strutted into dozens of HOA meetings. "Good afternoon, Ms. Hargrave," he said, his voice clipped, as if he were addressing a misbehaving student. "I assume you've noticed the changes." Simone's fists clenched. "You mean the destruction of my property?" "Yes." I noticed Gerald's mouth curved in something that wasn't quite a smile. "The bridge was in violation of multiple HOA codes. Unapproved structure, liability risk. The board voted to remove it." She stepped forward, her voice sharper now. "That bridge was there before half these houses were even built. Before your precious resort. My husband built it with his own hands, which makes it unpermitted," Gerald said smoothly. "I understand your attachment, but rules are rules. This community needs order if we're going to keep values high, especially with the resort attracting new buyers." Behind them, a few neighbors shifted awkwardly. Simone scanned their faces, searching for support, but most stayed silent. Ruth, though, crossed her arms. "That's not right, Gerald. She's lived here longer than any of us. That bridge hurt nobody." Gerald adjusted his sunglasses, unbothered. "I won't debate it here. If you have complaints, you can bring them up at the next board meeting." He turned to leave, the matter closed in his mind. Simone's voice cracked through the air. "You think you can take whatever you want, just because you sit at the head of a table. Gerald paused only long enough to say, "I can enforce what's necessary. Enjoy your afternoon." And with that, he walked back to his SUV, leaving Simone standing in the wreckage of her past. She bent to pick up a waterlogged plank, heavier than it looked, and held it in her hands. All around her, the lake shimmered as though nothing had happened. But in her chest, something shifted. She wasn't going to let Gerald bury her voice under HOA paperwork. But the real question was how far she was willing to go to remind him that her silence didn't mean surrender. If you asked 10 people in the Lake Ashford community about Gerald Wexler, you'd get 10 different answers. But every one of them would carry the same tone: irritation. Some would say he was organized. Others would admit he had standards. But most would simply call him what he was: controlling. Gerald had moved to Lake Ashford 15 years earlier, coming from Dallas after selling his chain of auto parts stores for a small fortune. He had money, he had time, and he had a burning desire to shape his environment exactly how he thought it should be. Within a year of moving in, he'd run for HOA president, and within 2, he had the position locked down. Every election since had been a formality. Nobody dared challenge him. On paper, he was the perfect resident. Lawn trimmed like a putting green, home painted to HOA-approved shades, vehicles spotless and parked at precise angles. But behind that polished exterior was a man obsessed with control. He lived for the monthly meetings where he could correct, scold, and dismiss. Neighbors had stories. Plenty of them. Like the time Gerald fined the Alvarez family $200 for leaving their recycling bin out past 8 a.m., even though their son had been hospitalized that night. Or when he forced an elderly couple, the Dunhams, to tear down their garden shed because it wasn't painted the community beige, costing them thousands. And who could forget when Gerald had a tree removed from the front of a widow's property because its roots threatened uniformity? These were not decisions made with compassion. They were reminders. Gerald was in charge. In Gerald's own mind, he wasn't cruel. He was a guardian. "Rules keep chaos at bay," he would say, tapping his clipboard like it was scripture. He liked to present himself as the protector of property values, the one ensuring Lake Ashford remained desirable. But those who watched closely saw the truth. Every rule he enforced somehow lined up with his personal tastes or financial gain. The Lakeside resort was his masterpiece. He pitched it as a shared community investment, something that would bring prestige, weddings, and tourism dollars. The HOA had poured more than $1.8 million into it. Landscaping, event halls, a renovated marina. Gerald saw it as his legacy, proof of his vision. But many residents, especially the older ones, saw it for what it was: a vanity project that drained their wallets. Simone Hargrave had been one of the loudest critics. She wasn't one for drama, but she spoke with clarity and calm at every meeting. "We bought homes on this lake because of the peace, not for noise and traffic," she said at one heated session, her voice carrying across the room. Gerald had smirked and said, "Peace doesn't pay the bills." That exchange was still talked about at barbecues and on porches, a moment when Simone's quiet strength had matched Gerald's arrogance, and he hadn't forgotten it. Ruth Callan remembered another story. She told Simone as they sat at her kitchen table later that afternoon, the wreckage of the bridge still heavy on their minds. When the Perkins boy parked his old pickup with the peeling paint by the clubhouse, Gerald called a special meeting to vote it off the lot, said it brought down the atmosphere. He just doesn't stop. Simone shook her head, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her coffee. "This isn't about rules, Ruth. It's about punishment. He wanted me quiet. And when I wouldn't back down, he took something that mattered to me." Ruth leaned closer, her voice dropping. "The thing about Gerald is, he always underestimates people. He thinks because you don't shout, you'll never fight back." At that same moment across town, Gerald was in the resort's lounge, sipping a bourbon with a few of his allies. The place reeked of polished wood and money. His money, their money. One man slapped him on the back. "Heard about the bridge." "Bold move," Gerald smirked, ice clinking in his glass. "Bold?" It was necessary. That bridge was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Liability like that can tank an association. A woman at the table tilted her head. "But Simone's lived here forever." "She's respected. Don't you think there'll be backlash?" Gerald leaned back, confidence radiating. "She's one voice. And voices like hers fade when the majority sees progress. In a month, nobody will remember the bridge. They'll remember the weddings we host here, the new buyers, the rising values." The table chuckled in agreement, but Gerald's eyes stayed cold. He thrived on control, but more than that, he thrived on silencing opposition. For him, this wasn't just about a bridge. It was about dominance. But outside the polished resort, whispers spread. Neighbors weren't as blind as he thought. Some pitied Simone, others admired her composure. And slowly, suspicion started to shift from Simone's old bridge to Gerald's growing appetite for power. But while Gerald basked in his victory, Simone was already thinking about the one thing he had overlooked: the dam at the south end of Lake Ashford. Before the noise of HOA politics and the wreckage of her bridge, Simone Hargrave lived a life most would have called quiet, but to her it was rich with meaning. Born and raised in Shreveport, Louisiana, she had moved to Texas in her mid-30s when Thomas's work in electrical engineering brought them to the Dallas-Fort Worth area. After decades of traffic, long commutes, and neighborhoods where no one knew each other's names, Lake Ashford felt like a gift. The house they bought wasn't the biggest on the water, not by a long shot, but it had two things Simone wanted most: a direct view of the sunrise across the lake, and a sliver of land that touched the water itself. She and Thomas had saved for years to afford it, and when they moved in, the first thing he suggested was the bridge. Not a decorative arch or some fancy pier, but a sturdy wooden walkway stretching from their backyard to a dock big enough to tie their modest fishing boat. For Simone, the bridge became more than just a convenience. It was where she and Thomas would sit at dusk, legs dangling over the edge, sharing conversations about the day. It was where their grandchildren, visiting from Austin, begged to sleep in tents, pretending the bridge was their pirate ship. And it was where, on the evening before Thomas's sudden heart attack 10 years ago, he had told her, "This place, this bridge, it'll outlast both of us. You'll always have it to keep me close." That memory kept Simone company through lonely years. Some nights she would stand on the bridge barefoot, letting the boards cool her soles, gazing out over the moonlit water. Other nights she cast her fishing line, even if she wasn't really fishing, just listening to the gentle slap of waves. It gave her rhythm, peace, and a tether to what she'd lost. Neighbors respected her for it. She wasn't loud at meetings. She didn't gossip. She showed up with potato salad for cookouts and casseroles when someone was sick. She kept her grass trimmed, her siding painted, but never competed with the residents who decorated their yards like catalogue covers. People described her with words like steady, dependable, and kind. And that was exactly why the demolition of her bridge cut deeper than most realized. It wasn't just wood. It was her memory of Thomas, her anchor through grief, her place of calm when life spun faster than she wanted. When Gerald took that, he wasn't enforcing rules. He was reaching into her personal history and ripping something irreplaceable. Ruth Callan, who had been Simone's friend since the day they both realized they shared a love for birdwatching, saw the toll immediately. Sitting across the kitchen table, Ruth shook her head. "You've been through enough, Simone. First losing Thomas, then the assessments, and now this. It's like he knows exactly where to hit you." Simone stirred her tea slowly, her spoon clicking against the ceramic cup. "Thomas always told me not to let people like Gerald rent space in my head. But it's hard, Ruth. That bridge wasn't hurting anyone. He did it because I told him." No, Ruth reached across the table, her hand covering Simone's. "He sees you as a threat because you don't bend." And honestly, he's scared of that. Simone gave a small laugh, though it was hollow. "Scared of me? I'm just one woman trying to hold on to the little I have left." "That's exactly why," Ruth countered. "You don't scare easy, and that makes you dangerous to a man like him." Later that evening, Simone took her folding chair down to the shore where the bridge used to begin. The ground was uneven now, bits of wood sticking out from the mud, the water lapping against the jagged remains. She set the chair down and sat, staring at the place where her life had been interrupted. As she sat there, she thought about the neighbors who had stayed silent that morning, people who had whispered sympathy, but said nothing in Gerald's presence. It reminded her of something her father used to tell her when she was a child. Silence is a choice, baby girl, and sometimes it's louder than words. She pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and let the thought linger. Maybe Gerald expected her to retreat. Maybe he believed she'd accept the loss as if it were fate. But the bridge wasn't just about her anymore. It was about whether someone like Gerald could strip people of what mattered, unchallenged. Her eyes drifted to the far southern end of the lake, where the dam stood, old concrete walls and a steel gate she hadn't paid much attention to in years. It was there when they bought the house, and every now and then maintenance crews came out to check it. She remembered Thomas once saying, "Funny thing, Simone. Part of this land, technically, gives us rights to that dam. Strange little clause buried in the deed. But who'd ever need it?" She stared a little longer at the shadowed shape of the dam across the water, the idea planting itself like a seed. Gerald had taken her bridge in the dead of night. He had stolen her peace. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as powerless as he believed. But while Simone sat alone with her memories, Gerald was already preparing his next move, convinced she'd stay quiet. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following Tuesday evening at the community center in Tyler, Texas, a squat brick building with fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead and folding chairs set in neat rows. Simone hadn't planned on going. Normally she avoided these gatherings. She hated the bickering, the raised voices, the way Gerald Wexler strutted around as though the place belonged to him. But this time, she felt she had no choice. When she walked in, heads turned. A few neighbors gave her sympathetic looks, others quickly looked away, unwilling to be seen taking sides. Ruth followed close behind her, gripping her tote bag like a shield. Simone spotted Gerald at the front of the room, already talking to two board members. He wore a pale blue polo and khakis, his clipboard tucked under his arm. His smile was wide, but there was nothing warm about it. As the meeting began, Gerald cleared his throat and adjusted the microphone. "Thank you all for coming. Tonight we'll address updates on the resort expansion, security guidelines, and of course, maintenance issues across the community." Simone felt her chest tighten. Maintenance. That was the word he would use. Not destruction, not theft. Maintenance. Half an hour passed, with Gerald droning about landscaping budgets and vendor bids. Finally, Ruth whispered, "Now, Simone. You can't let him skate past it." Simone stood, her chair scraping across the linoleum floor. "Excuse me," she said, her voice firm, though her hands trembled slightly. "Before we move on, I want to address what happened to my bridge." The room fell into an uneasy hush. Gerald looked up, feigning surprise. "Yes, Miss Hargrave?" "You ordered it torn down," she said. "Without notice, without permission. That bridge was part of my property. You had no right," Gerald set down his clipboard with exaggerated care. "Miss Hargrave, your structure was unpermitted and posed a liability. The board approved its removal unanimously." "That's not true," Ruth called out. "There was no vote at the last meeting." Murmurs rippled through the room. Gerald's jaw tensed, though his smile stayed fixed. "Some matters don't require full board discussion when safety is at stake. The bylaws clearly allow for immediate action in cases where liability threatens the association." Simone shook her head. "That bridge stood for nearly 2 decades without incident. You didn't remove it for safety. You removed it because I opposed your resort project." Gasps scattered among the neighbors. Gerald chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "That's quite an accusation. I assure you, personal feelings play no part in HOA decisions." "Then explain why it happened in the middle of the night," Simone pressed. "If it was legitimate, why not notify me? Why not let me appeal? Why use trucks under cover of darkness?" The room buzzed louder now, neighbors whispering to one another. Gerald raised his hands, trying to calm the noise. "Please, let's not spiral into conspiracy theories. We follow procedures." "No," Simone interrupted, her voice carrying over the room. "You follow your procedures. Your rules, your way of running this place like your private kingdom. But you forget something, Gerald. We live here too. We have rights. You don't get to bulldoze our lives because it makes you feel powerful." The tension was thick enough to choke on. Gerald's allies at the front exchanged uneasy glances. A man in the third row, Mr. Jensen, spoke up. "She's right. We never voted on that bridge, and I've lived here long enough to know it wasn't unsafe." Others chimed in. A woman near the back. "What's next, Gerald? You don't like my deck. You tear it down too." Another man. "Feels like we're paying fees so you can do whatever you want." Gerald's composure cracked for the first time. His cheeks flushed red. "Enough! This meeting is not a circus. If residents have grievances, there are proper channels." Simone's gaze locked on him, steady as stone. "And what happens when those channels lead straight back to you? When the man at the top is the problem?" The room erupted again, voices colliding. Some defended Gerald, insisting he kept the neighborhood orderly. Others accused him of going too far, of forgetting that real people lived behind the fences and manicured lawns. Through it all, Simone stood tall. For once, her voice wasn't quiet, and it resonated far beyond her words. It wasn't just about her bridge anymore, it was about whether Gerald's grip on the community would ever be challenged. Finally, Gerald slammed his clipboard onto the table. "This discussion is closed. If you believe you have a case, Ms. Hargrave, I suggest you take it to court." Simone sat down slowly, her pulse racing, but inside her a fire had been lit. She had forced him to show his temper. She had made the neighbors look at him differently. She hadn't won, but she had cracked the mask. But Gerald had no idea that Simone wasn't finished, and the next move wouldn't happen in a meeting room, it would happen on the water. In the days after the meeting, Lake Ashford didn't feel the same. The air was thicker somehow, conversations sharper, and neighborly smiles just a little too quick to vanish once backs were turned. The demolition of Simone's bridge had stirred something larger than anyone expected. It was no longer just about wood and nails. It was about control, money, and the kind of community people wanted to live in. On a breezy Thursday morning, Simone went for her usual walk along the Lakeside trail. She could feel eyes on her as she passed. Some neighbors waved, offering words of encouragement. "We're with you, Simone," said Mr. Jensen, the retired schoolteacher who had spoken up at the meeting. "He's been riding roughshod over us for too long." But not everyone felt the same. Near the clubhouse, Simone overheard two women talking as they arranged flowers by the entrance. "She's making a scene," one of them muttered. "Gerald's just keeping things safe." That bridge was a hazard, Simone kept walking, but the words stung. It reminded her of something she already knew. The neighborhood was divided. Some feared Gerald, but admired his order. Others were tired of his heavy hand, but hesitant to speak out. That evening, Ruth came over with a casserole, insisting Simone couldn't survive on tea and crackers alone. They ate at the kitchen table, the sunset casting gold across the lake. "You made waves at that meeting," Ruth said between bites. "Some people are finally waking up, but others, they'll cling to him no matter what. They're afraid of rocking the boat." Simone sighed. "Afraid of him, you mean? He's turned this place into a monarchy." "Maybe so," Ruth said, leaning in. "But monarchs fall. Always have, always will." The following Saturday, Gerald called a special HOA gathering, billed as an information session about upcoming resort improvements. Word spread fast and curiosity filled the community center. Simone didn't want to go, but Ruth convinced her. "You need to see how far he'll stretch this. And people need to see your face." The room was packed. Gerald stood at the front with a projector displaying glossy photos of weddings, banquets, and boat rentals. "This resort," he announced, "is the future of Lake Ashford. It's why property values here are higher than anywhere in Smith County. But for us to reach our potential, we need upgrades, expanded docks, landscaping, and a new events pavilion. The cost will be shared, of course, through a modest assessment." A groan rippled through the crowd. "Another assessment?" someone shouted. "We just paid for renovations last year." Gerald's voice sharpened. "Investments pay off. Do you want to live in a community people admire, or do you want to watch values plummet?" Simone rose from her seat, heart pounding. Funny how the word investment keeps meaning money out of our pockets and into your pet projects. Maybe we should ask why the resort matters more than the people who live here. Murmurs of agreement swept the room. Gerald's eyes narrowed. Miss Hargrave, if you can't appreciate the benefits, perhaps Lake Ashford isn't the right community for you. Gasps filled the air. A man in the back shouted, "She's lived here longer than you, Gerald." Another voice. "He tore down her bridge without a vote. What's next?" The room split like a crack in ice. Some residents argued loudly in Gerald's defense. "He's protecting us from lawsuits," while others pointed at Simone as proof that he was abusing power. Chairs scraped against the floor, voices overlapped, and the meeting spiraled into chaos. In the corner, Ruth tugged Simone's arm. "See? He's losing his grip. They're not all on his side anymore." But Gerald wasn't backing down. He slammed his hand against the podium, his voice booming. "Enough! We are not here to indulge petty grievances. This is about the future of our community. If you can't see that, you're free to sell your home and leave." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. People looked at one another, unsettled by the suggestion that dissenters had no place here. Simone stood taller. "Or maybe the future of this community is about neighbors who stand up when one of us is wronged. Maybe it's about remembering that rules are supposed to serve us, not break us." A few people clapped, soft at first, then stronger. Gerald's face tightened, but he didn't respond. He simply clicked off the projector and declared the meeting adjourned. Outside, under the parking lot lights, neighbors gathered in clusters, voices hushed but animated. Some swore they'd had enough of Gerald. Others said Simone was making things worse. But one thing was clear. The neighborhood was no longer united under Gerald's rule. Cracks were showing, and Simone had lit the fuse. But while the community argued over sides, Simone was already digging through her files, searching for the deed Thomas had once mentioned, the one that tied her land to the old dam. That night, Simone sat cross-legged on the floor of her study with papers spread out like fallen leaves. The air smelled faintly of dust and lemon polish. She opened old file boxes Thomas had labeled years ago: mortgage, repairs, property deed. He had been meticulous, the kind of man who saved every receipt and highlighted every clause. Back then she teased him for being too careful. Now, she silently thanked him. Her fingers traced over brittle pages until she found what she was looking for: the original deed to their property. The document was thick with legal jargon, but Simone read slowly, determined to understand. Near the bottom of one page, she spotted the line Thomas had once pointed out. Her eyes widened. "Including shared access and rights of maintenance to the dam and water management structures located at the southern outlet of Lake Ashford." She whispered it aloud, the words both terrifying and empowering. Thomas hadn't been joking. Their property wasn't just tied to the lake, it was tied to the dam that held it together. Simone leaned back, staring at the ceiling. Gerald had taken her bridge because he thought she was powerless. But he had overlooked this. She wasn't just a resident bound by HOA rules. She was, on paper, part owner of the very mechanism that gave the lake its life. The next morning, Ruth came over with her usual coffee and gossip. Simone slid the deed across the table. "Read this." Ruth adjusted her glasses, scanning the lines. Her jaw dropped. "Are you telling me you can actually control the dam?" "That's what it says," Simone replied. "Shared access, maintenance rights. It means Gerald doesn't own the water, Ruth. Neither does the HOA. Part of that responsibility belongs to me." Ruth looked both amazed and terrified. "If he knew this—" "He doesn't," Simone cut in. "And I don't intend to tell him." For the first time in days, a flicker of determination sparked in Simone's chest. She wasn't reckless by nature, but Gerald had pushed her past patience. The bridge had been her last tether to peace, and now she had something of equal weight in her hands. That evening, she drove to the southern end of the lake. The road was narrow and cracked, weaving through tall pines until it opened to the dam. The structure loomed against the sky, concrete, weathered, but solid. A chain-link fence surrounded it, but a gate stood at the center, secured with a rusted padlock. Simone fished a key from her pocket. One Thomas had left on a ring marked Dam Access. She had never used it. Her hands trembled as she slid it into the lock. It clicked open. The path down to the sluice gate was steep and smelled of damp stone. At the base stood a heavy steel wheel attached to gears, the mechanism for releasing water. Moss clung to its edges, and spiderwebs stretched between the pipes. It looked ancient, but intact. Simone placed her hands on the wheel, feeling the cold metal under her palms. She didn't turn it, not yet. But in that moment, she realized just how much power she held. Gerald had his resort, his meetings, his clipboard. But this dam, was the beating heart of Lake Ashford. Without it, the lake was nothing but a drained valley. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was Ruth. "You okay down there?" Simone exhaled slowly. "I'm fine." Just seeing it with my own eyes, Ruth hesitated. "Simone, I need to ask, what are you thinking of doing?" Simone stared at the wheel, the sound of rushing water faint beyond the concrete walls. "I'm thinking Gerald believes he has all the control, but he doesn't. Not anymore." That night, back home, Simone couldn't sleep. She walked from room to room, the deed clutched in her hand. She thought of Thomas, of his words about the bridge outlasting them both. She thought of the humiliation Gerald had forced her to swallow, of the silence in that meeting room when he dismissed her as if she were nothing. Her reflection in the window stared back at her. A woman who had endured grief, stood through storms and kept going. She wasn't a fighter by nature, but she knew when enough was enough. And now, she had a choice. But while Simone wrestled with her decision, Gerald was boasting to his allies that the bridge incident had put her in her place. He had no idea she was about to rewrite the rules of the entire lake. The night Simone made her decision was unremarkable on the surface. A Tuesday in late spring, the kind of evening when the air smelled faintly of cut grass and the frogs croaked lazily at the shoreline. But inside her chest, everything was restless. She sat at her kitchen table with the deed spread open once more. The line about the dam seemed to glow under the lamplight. Thomas's handwriting lingered in the margins, notes about property taxes and a reminder to check the water meter. She pressed her fingertips to the paper, feeling as if he were there, guiding her. By 10 o'clock, Simone grabbed her flashlight and the key she had found. She slipped into a windbreaker, pulled her hood tight, and drove her pickup toward the southern road. The streets were quiet, most neighbors tucked in for the night. She passed the resort, its lights glimmering across the water, laughter drifting faintly from a private party inside. Gerald was probably there, enjoying bourbon and bragging about order and progress. She parked near the dam and cut her headlights. The night was still, the only sound the distant lap of water against the concrete. The padlock on the gate gave way easily with the old key. She slipped through, her flashlight beam dancing across the weathered path. When she reached the wheel, her breath caught. Up close, the sluice gate was massive, steel and bolts older than she was, glistening with condensation. The wheel itself stood at shoulder height, thick and cold, attached to gears that disappeared into the shadows. It looked immovable, a giant frozen in time. Her heart pounded. Could she really do this? Could she alter the very shape of the lake? She thought of Gerald's smirk as he dismissed her. She thought of the bridge, shattered in the mud, of Thomas's promise that it would outlast them both. She thought of the silence in that meeting room, neighbors too afraid to speak until she forced the words out of them. She placed both hands on the wheel and pushed. It resisted at first, groaning like a beast awakened from sleep. Her shoulders strained, muscles burning as the wheel finally inched forward. Metal screeched, gears grinding against rust. She pushed harder, her jaw clenched, sweat prickling her forehead despite the night air. With a shudder, the wheel turned half a revolution. A deep rumble vibrated through the ground. Then, a sound like thunder, water rushing, surging. The sluice gate opened just enough to release a powerful stream. She stumbled back, flashlight beam darting wildly as she watched the current roar into the channel below. The lake shifted before her eyes, the surface rippling violently as the water sought its escape. Frogs croaked louder, startled from their perches. Birds erupted from the trees, wings beating into the darkness. Simone braced herself, the sound of the rushing water filling her ears. It wasn't chaos. It was cleansing, raw and unstoppable. For years, Gerald had dictated what stayed and what went. But here, at this dam, the decision was hers. She tightened the wheel another quarter turn. More water surged out, frothing white against the rocks. The smell of wet earth rose from the channel. Her heart raced, but for the first time in weeks, she felt control. She stood there for several minutes, flashlight trembling in her grip, watching as the lake slowly dropped, inch by inch. She didn't drain it dry. Not yet. She didn't need to. Just enough to send a message. Enough to remind Gerald Wexler that she was not powerless. Finally, she turned the wheel back a notch, steadying the release so the outflow continued at a measured pace. The roar dulled, but did not stop. The lake would not be the same by morning. As she walked back up the path, locking the gate behind her, Simone's knees nearly gave out from the adrenaline. Her hands were trembling, her throat dry, but her resolve had hardened. She didn't know what would come next. Anger, lawsuits, retaliation. But she knew one thing. Gerald had underestimated her. Driving home, she passed the resort again. Music still pulsed inside, laughter spilling onto the deck. Those celebrating had no idea that the water beneath their glowing lights was already slipping away, inch by inch, into the night. When Simone pulled into her driveway, she turned off the engine and sat in the silence. The lake shimmered faintly in the distance, but she could already see the shoreline receding. She exhaled, a slow and deliberate breath. What had been taken from her could never return. But what she had done tonight, that was hers, and hers alone. But while Simone tried to steady herself, the community would wake to a sight that would shake them all, their prized lake shrinking before their eyes. By dawn, Lake Ashford no longer sparkled with its usual fullness. From Simone's window, she could see the exposed shoreline, stretching further out than it had in decades. The dock posts jutted awkwardly from the mud like broken teeth. Patches of lakebed, cracked and slimy, lay exposed where children once swam and kayaks once glided. She wrapped her cardigan tight and walked to the shore. The air carried the smell of wet soil and algae, heavy and sour. Birds pecked at worms wriggling in the fresh muck, and fish flopped helplessly in shallow pools. She bent down, lifting one in her hands, scales slick against her palms. With a soft toss, she threw it into deeper water. Her throat tightened. This wasn't just symbolic anymore. This was real. Across the lake she heard voices. Neighbors were gathering, pointing, gesturing wildly at the vanishing waterline. The first to storm down to the resort docks was Barry Klein, a realtor who had made a living selling the dream of Lake Ashford living. Simone watched from a distance as Barry shouted into his phone, pacing furiously, his white sneakers sinking into mud where pristine water had been just days ago. By 9 o'clock, the resort was buzzing with panic. The general manager, a wiry man named Paul Everett, tried to calm a group of frantic staff. "We've got weddings on the calendar, 2 this weekend. We can't host lakeside photos with this," he said, pointing at the ugly shoreline where a dead carp now floated belly up. Inside the lobby, guests were demanding refunds. One woman in a floral dress snapped at the front desk clerk. "This is not what your brochure promised. We came here for lakefront views, not a swamp." Meanwhile, homeowners gathered in clumps along the trails. Conversations turned heated. Some whispered that Gerald had finally gone too far, that Simone must have been pushed into a corner. Others shook their heads, convinced Simone had destroyed the lake in blind revenge. By mid-morning, Gerald arrived. He strode into the resort parking lot, face tight, phone glued to his ear. His SUV door slammed with such force that people flinched. "Yes, I'm aware," he barked into the phone. "No, the HOA didn't authorize this. It's sabotage, plain and simple. We'll find out who's responsible." He ended the call and turned to Barry, who was still fuming. "We can fix this. The dam can be adjusted. It's just a temporary drop," Barry scoffed. "Temporary? Do you know how many buyers are going to walk away after seeing this? You've been bragging about this lake for years, Gerald. Now look at it." Residents swarmed around, demanding answers. A mother clutched her child's hand and asked, "What about safety? If the water keeps dropping, what happens to the docks? The fish? The wildlife?" Another man yelled, Forget the fish. What happens to our property values? Gerald raised his hands, his voice booming over the crowd. Everyone calm down. The board is investigating. Once we determine who tampered with the dam, there will be consequences. Simone stood at the edge of the gathering, arms folded. Her heart raced, but she kept her face steady. When Gerald's eyes swept over the crowd and landed on her, the corners of his mouth twitched. For the first time, he didn't smirk. He knew. Neighbors followed his gaze, whispers rippling through the group. Do you think she... One woman murmured. She's got the right, doesn't she? Didn't Thomas tell her something about it? Ruth stepped up beside Simone, her voice carrying louder than intended. If you ask me, Gerald, this is the price of tearing down what wasn't yours to take. The crowd turned. Gerald stiffened, his face reddening. Are you accusing me of causing this? I'm saying you provoked it, Ruth replied firmly. You pushed too hard. You humiliated her. And now we're all paying for your arrogance. The group buzzed again, voices clashing. Some nodded in agreement with Ruth, others muttered about recklessness. But the seed was planted. People were questioning Gerald openly, in broad daylight. At noon, a reporter from the Tyler Morning Telegraph pulled into the lot, camera slung over her shoulder. We're covering reports of sudden water loss at Lake Ashford, she said, jotting notes as homeowners rushed to vent their frustrations. The headline practically wrote itself. Resort town's lake drains overnight. Residents blame HOA battle. By the time the sun reached its peak, the resort's once prized waterfront was nothing more than a muddy wasteland. Paddleboats sat stranded, docks sagged into shallow puddles, and the jewel of Smith County, as Gerald had called it, looked like a forgotten quarry. Simone walked home slowly, her shoes squelching in damp soil. Her hands shook, not from regret, but from the sheer weight of what she'd set in motion. She had taken back power in the only way she could. Yet the consequences stretched far beyond her property. The entire community was staring into the mirror now, and the reflection wasn't pretty. But as the day dragged on and anger boiled hotter, Gerald wasn't thinking about the lake anymore. He was thinking about how to crush Simone before she destroyed his empire completely. By the next morning, the lake wasn't just lower, it was a spectacle. Cars lined the roadside as outsiders drove in to gawk at the exposed mud flats and stranded docks. Someone had even set up a tripod near the dam, filming for social media. Within hours, Lake Ashford drained became a trending tag in Texas. And with every post, every photo, the HOA's prized reputation unraveled further. Gerald Wexler felt the walls closing in. At the resort's conference hall, he paced before a half-circle of board members. "This is sabotage!" he barked, slamming his palm against the polished table. "We cannot allow one disgruntled homeowner to dismantle everything we've built here." One board member, a petite woman named Sherry Lang, shifted nervously. "But Gerald, if her deed really does give her rights to the dam, then legally—" Gerald cut her off. "I don't care what her deed says. She's destroyed community property. We'll sue. We'll make an example out of her." Another board member, Leonard Banks, cleared his throat. "With respect, Gerald, maybe we should consider negotiating. People are angry, not just at her, but at us. They're asking why the HOA had the power to tear down her bridge without a vote." The room went quiet. Gerald's jaw flexed, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the back of his chair. "You think I'm the villain here? That woman turned this community into a circus. You know how many cancellations we've had in the last 24 hours? 23. Weddings, retreats, you name it. If we don't take control of this narrative, Lake Ashford is finished." Meanwhile, Simone sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee while Ruth read aloud from the morning paper. The headline sprawled across the front page. "Bridge battle leads to lake disaster." "They're calling you the underdog," Ruth said, a mix of pride and worry in her voice. "But Gerald, they're painting him like a tyrant," Simone sighed. "I didn't want this kind of spotlight." Ruth leaned closer. "Maybe not, but you've forced everyone to look at the truth. He can't hide behind his rules anymore." The phone rang. Simone hesitated before answering. On the other end was Barry Klein, the realtor. His voice was sharp, impatient. "Simone, listen." You need to fix this. You don't know what you've done. My clients are furious. Buyers are walking away. Do you realize property values could drop by half if this lake doesn't recover?" Simone's tone was calm. "Then maybe people should ask why one man had so much power that it came to this." Barry cursed under his breath. "You're playing with fire." Gerald won't back down. She hung up before he could say more. That evening, the HOA called an emergency community meeting at the same brick building where the last confrontation had happened. This time, the atmosphere was electric. Dozens of residents filled the chairs, their voices loud even before Gerald stepped to the microphone. He raised his hands. "Neighbors, I know tensions are high, but I assure you the board is taking every measure to restore the lake. We've contacted the county and we're exploring legal action against the individual responsible." A voice interrupted from the back. "You mean Simone?" All heads turned toward her. Simone stood slowly, her posture steady. "I didn't hide. I didn't sneak into anyone's property. My deed gave me rights to the dam. Rights that were ignored when my bridge was torn down." Gasps filled the room. Gerald's face flushed. "You admit it then? You admit you drained the lake?" "I opened what I had every legal right to open," Simone replied. "I didn't destroy anything. The lake is still here. But maybe for once people are seeing the cost of your arrogance." The room erupted, some clapping, others shouting in protest. Gerald's allies accused Simone of ruining their investments, while her supporters argued she had simply defended herself. Voices overlapped, tempers flared, and at one point, two men nearly came to blows before being pulled apart. Finally, Mr. Jensen, the retired teacher, stood up and raised his voice. "Enough! This community isn't about resorts or property values, it's about people. Gerald, you tore down something that meant everything to Simone. And Simone, you reminded us that none of us should ever feel powerless in our own homes. Maybe both of you went too far, but if we don't learn something from this, then we've all lost more than a lake." The room quieted. People shifted in their seats, uneasy, but listening. Simone felt her chest tighten at his words. He was right. Her choice had consequences, and not just for Gerald. The community had been caught in the crossfire. Gerald, though, couldn't let go. "This isn't about lessons. This is about order. Without rules, this community collapses." Simone met his gaze. "Rules without fairness are just chains." The silence that followed was heavier than shouting. For the first time, Gerald didn't have an immediate retort. His grip on the crowd had slipped. But while neighbors wrestled with anger and doubt, the truth was already undeniable. Lake Ashford would never look the same again, and neither would the community that had grown around it. The following week, Lake Ashford settled into an uneasy stillness. The water level remained low, a scar on the land that could not be hidden. The resort sat eerily quiet, weddings cancelled, docks abandoned, and the usual hum of activity replaced by silence. But the community itself buzzed with a new kind of energy, one that didn't revolve around Gerald Wexler's clipboard. At the grocery store, neighbors exchanged wary glances, whispering about the bridge war that had spilled into their lives. Some avoided Simone altogether, unwilling to choose sides. Others stopped her in the aisles, squeezing her hand and whispering words of quiet support. "You did what we couldn't," one elderly man told her near the produce section. You reminded him he's not invincible. For Gerald, the fallout was relentless. Real estate agents refused to host open houses until the lake stabilized. Local newspapers ran follow-up pieces questioning the HOA's authority, digging into old fines and sudden enforcements that looked suspiciously self-serving. Even the county sent inspectors to review the HOA's role in the lake's management. At the next HOA meeting, the turnout was larger than ever. Gerald walked to the front, but his stride lacked its usual confidence. He cleared his throat, but his voice wavered. "The board has received petitions requesting a leadership change. As president, I have always acted in what I believed to be the community's best interest. However, if residents feel differently..." He trailed off, scanning the room. Dozens of eyes stared back at him, unblinking. For the first time in years, Gerald Wexler was no longer feared. He was just a man whose power had slipped through his fingers. Ruth leaned toward Simone and whispered, He's done. He knows it. When Gerald finally resigned at the end of the meeting, a ripple of relief washed through the crowd. There were no cheers, no applause, just a collective exhale, as though everyone had been holding their breath for too long. Afterward, Simone walked home slowly, her heart heavy but steady. She hadn't set out to be a hero, and she certainly didn't feel like one. What she had done carried weight. Businesses lost money, neighbors suffered inconvenience, and the lake itself bore scars that would take months, maybe years, to heal. But she also knew that silence had a price, and Gerald had counted on her silence to keep him untouchable. Later that evening, Simone sat at the shoreline in her folding chair, gazing at the water. It was lower now, yes, but still shimmering under the fading sun. She whispered, as though Thomas were sitting beside her. "I didn't want this fight, but I think you'd understand why I did it." Ruth joined her, setting down 2 mugs of tea. "You know," she said softly, "you've changed this place. People will remember what happened here for a long time." Simone nodded. "Maybe they'll remember more than just the fight. Maybe they'll remember that you can't bully people forever. That sooner or later, even the quietest voice finds a way to be heard." The lake lapped gently at the muddy bank, a reminder that life goes on, even after upheaval. The community would rebuild, the water would return, and in time, the scars, on the land and in the hearts of the neighbors, would fade. But one lesson would remain. Power without respect collapses, and arrogance always meets its match. As Simone rose to head inside, she felt lighter. Not victorious, not defeated, simply resolved. She had protected her dignity, reminded her neighbors of theirs, and shown that even against the loudest, most controlling voice, one person's courage could tilt the balance. And maybe that's the lesson for all of us. Never mistake silence for weakness, because sometimes it's the quietest people who make the loudest impact. If you found yourself gripped by Simone's story, remember this. There are Geralds in every community, but there are also Simones, people willing to stand up, even when it costs them. If you believe in that message, make sure you subscribe so you won't miss the next story that reminds us of the power of courage, fairness, and the will to fight for what's right.